Picture a parking lot behind stage 12 at Warner Brothers Studios. Burbank, California. October 1971. The asphalt still holds the day's heat, 91 degrees at 4 in the afternoon. And the lot is empty except for two men and a single overhead light that hasn't fully caught yet in the fading sun. One of them is 64 years old. He has made 142 films. He has survived 3 divorces, a lung removed, 2 wars he wasn't allowed to fight in, and 40 years of Hollywood politics that would have consumed a lesser man entirely. He stands 6 feet 4 inches, still 220 pounds, still carrying himself the way a man carries himself when he has decided, once and forever, that he will not be moved. The other man is 41. He has made exactly 9 films as a leading man. His face has appeared on more movie posters than almost anyone alive in 1971, but he carries a quiet inside him that unnerves directors, confuses producers, and makes audiences lean forward in their seats without understanding why. He is 6 feet 4 as well, but where the older man is a mountain, this one is a canyon, defined by what isn't there. John Wayne reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it out. Clint Eastwood didn't take it. What happened in the next 4 minutes? No cameras, no witnesses except one studio electrician who would spend the next 30 years telling people nobody would believe him, is what this story is about. This is that story. To understand what was at stake in that parking lot, you have to go back 18 months, to a morning in April 1970, when Hollywood was in the middle of one of its periodic identity crises. The kind that happens every decade when the audience stops responding to what the studios are selling and nobody in a suit can figure out why. The Western was dying. That was the conventional wisdom in every studio meeting from Burbank to Century City. The numbers supported it. Between 1958 and 1965, Westerns had accounted for nearly 30% of all major studio releases. By 1970, that figure had dropped to 11%, and the ones that were making money, Leon's Pictures, Peckinpah's Pictures, were doing it in ways that made the old guard deeply uncomfortable. The violence was different. The heroes were different. The silence between the dialogue meant something different. John Wayne understood all of this. He had spent more hours on Western sets than almost any living person. Since 1930, he had appeared in 83 Westerns across 4 decades, more than any other actor in the sound era. He had ridden with Yakima Canet, trained under Paul Fix, and absorbed 40 years of what worked and what didn't from directors including John Ford, Howard Hawks, and Henry Hathaway. When Wayne walked onto a Western set, he wasn't performing a genre. He was the genre. But here's where it changes. Wayne had watched the Italian Westerns arrive with the attention of a general studying a new army's tactics. He had seen A Fistful of Dollars in a private screening in 1966, and his reaction, recorded in a letter to his producing partner Michael Wayne, was not dismissal. It was recognition. That man Eastwood, he wrote, has found something real in the silence. The question is whether he knows what he's found or whether it found him. That question would take 5 years to answer. The man at the center of this story, Clint Eastwood, had arrived in Hollywood's consciousness through a route that defied every standard playbook. Born May 31, 1930, in San Francisco, he had spent his 20s in the near wilderness of bit parts and studio contract work, a face without a vehicle, a presence without a frame. The break, when it came, didn't come from Hollywood at all. Sergio Leone cast him in A Fistful of Dollars in 1964 for $15,000 and a percentage. The Italian critics were ambivalent. The American studios barely noticed. The audiences in Europe noticed immediately. By 1970, Eastwood had returned from Italy with something nobody had expected: a new language for the Western hero. The man with no name didn't explain himself. He didn't deliver the moral of the story. He arrived, he assessed, he acted, and he left, and the absence of justification was, paradoxically, what made him magnetic. Audiences didn't need him to tell them what he stood for. They could see it in the angle of his shoulders and the economy of his movements. Leone had not invented this quality in Eastwood. He had excavated it. And now, back in America, every major studio wanted to know how to use it. Eastwood was 40 years old in 1970, shooting Play Misty for Me on the Monterey Peninsula. His directorial debut, a film about a jazz DJ stalked by an obsessive fan. It was a small picture by Hollywood standards, budgeted at $950,000, and the studio had given him the directing job partly because nobody expected it to cost much if it failed. He was working 17-hour days, acting and directing simultaneously, solving problems that had no textbook solutions, and he was doing it with a focused calm that his crew would later describe as either inspiring or unnerving, depending on the day. Wayne's people had been watching. The call that connected them came through Michael Wayne in early September 1970. The elder Wayne had seen the dailies from Play Misty for Me, through channels he declined to specify, and had decided, on the basis of what he saw, that this was a conversation he needed to have. Wayne was 62 years old, just back from location shooting on Big Jake in Durango, Mexico. He had survived a bout with lung cancer in 1964 that had removed his left lung and 3 ribs. He was still working at a pace that exhausted actors half his age. And he had, in the previous 2 years, watched the Western shift beneath him in ways that made him both concerned and intellectually engaged. He asked for a meeting. Eastwood agreed. And that's when it started, not with a confrontation, but with an invitation that contained, buried inside its politeness, a test. The first meeting happened on the Warner Brothers lot on a Thursday morning in October 1970, in Wayne's personal bungalow near the executive suites. Studio records from that period show Wayne was between productions. Big Jake had wrapped in August, and the Cowboys wouldn't begin until February 1971. He had time, which meant he had been thinking. Eastwood arrived at 9:15 a.m. Wayne was already there. The bungalow was unimpressive by studio standards, a single large room with a desk, 2 chairs, a small wet bar, and walls covered not with framed posters, but with working photographs, the kind taken during production, most of them involving horses. Eastwood would later say, in one of the very few interviews where he addressed this period at all, that the photographs told him more about Wayne than any film had. They were all process shots, not triumph shots, not award shots. The photographs of a man who was interested in the work, not the record of the work. Wayne did not stand when Eastwood entered. This was noticed. In Hollywood bungalow culture, a star of Wayne's stature standing to greet a visitor was a signal, a performed gesture of welcome. Not standing was either an insult or an invitation to dispensing with performance entirely. Eastwood decided, in the 3 seconds it took him to cross the room, that it was the second thing. He sat down without being offered a seat. Wayne looked at him for a moment, 4, maybe 5 seconds, with that particular stillness that people who worked with him consistently described as unsettling until they understood it. He wasn't reading Eastwood the way a man reads a stranger. He was reading him the way a man reads a situation, with patience, without agenda, looking for the thing that was actually there rather than the thing that was presented. "I've been watching your pictures," Wayne said. Not a compliment, not a criticism. A statement of fact, delivered flatly, that functioned as the opening gambit of a conversation that would continue, in various forms, for the next 12 months. What Wayne said next, Eastwood kept largely private for decades. The outline, assembled from a 1984 interview in Esquire, a brief mention in a 1997 Playboy piece, and a comment Eastwood made during a Directors Guild tribute in 2004, goes roughly like this. Wayne told Eastwood that the silence was right but the context was wrong. That the man with no name worked in Europe because European audiences were watching from a distance. The American West as mythology, as dream, as someone else's story. That bringing the same silence back to American audiences without giving them something to hold on to beneath, it would eventually hollow the films out. That an audience could sustain mystery for 2 hours. They could not sustain it for a career. Wayne had a theory, and the theory was this. The Western hero needed to be comprehensible. Not explained, comprehensible. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. He reached into his desk and produced a 3-page document he had written himself, longhand, on yellow legal paper. Scene structures. Moments of revealed humanity he believed Eastwood was avoiding. Specific beats. A man helping someone who cannot help him back. A decision that costs him something real. That would, in Wayne's view, anchor the silence in something audiences could recognize. He held it out across the desk. Eastwood looked at it. He didn't take it. The air in the bungalow changed. Not dramatically. There was no raised voice, no slammed fist, no heat in either man's expression. But the electrician who was working on a lighting rig in the hallway outside, a 23-year-old named Bobby Ferrara, who had been on the lot for 8 months and would spend the next 3 decades in studio electrical work, would later say that he stopped what he was doing because the silence that came through the door was a specific kind of silence. The kind, he said, when 2 big dogs first see each other. Eastwood said, and this is the line that various sources confirm, though the exact wording varies slightly. I appreciate you thinking about this. Not thank you. Not I'll look it over. Not any of the dozen social lubricants that Hollywood had developed over half a century for precisely these moments. I appreciate you thinking about this. Wayne put the paper back on the desk without looking at it. He studied Eastwood's face for a moment. Not angry, not performing, studied calm, genuinely reading. You think I'm wrong, Wayne said. I think we're looking at different problems, Eastwood said. What happened next, nobody expected. Wayne leaned back in his chair. All 6 feet 4 inches of him, the broad shoulders, the working hands, the face that had been projected onto screens in 142 films. And he laughed. Not a social laugh. Not a dismissive laugh. A genuine, slightly surprised laugh. The kind that happens when a man hears something that reminds him of himself at a specific age. All right, he said. Tell me the problem you're looking at. And here is where the story becomes something other than what it first appeared to be. Because Clint Eastwood didn't defend his silence. He didn't justify the man with no name. He didn't argue with Wayne's theory about audience comprehension or contest the diagnosis about European versus American viewing. He said, the audience doesn't need to understand the man. They need to trust him. And those are completely different things. The room was quiet for close to 10 seconds. Wayne picked up the yellow legal paper. He looked at it. He set it down again, this time face down. How long have you known that? He asked. Since the third Sergio picture, Eastwood said. Took me 2 pictures to find it and 1 to know what it was. That first meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, running well past the 11 o'clock mark that Wayne had originally suggested as a stopping point. What emerged from it was not agreement. Not on the specific structural points Wayne had put in his yellow paper notes, not on the mechanics of revealed humanity versus trusted mystery. What emerged from it was, by all available accounts, something rarer in Hollywood than agreement. Genuine recognition. 2 men who had each, through different routes and different decades, arrived at a deep understanding of what the camera did to a certain kind of stillness, and who found, in the space of a single conversation, that they were the only 2 people in the building who had the exact same obsession from exactly opposite angles. Wayne was convinced that the Western hero's power came from what he was willing to do for people who hadn't earned it yet. The action before the justification. The loyalty before the proof. His heroes, Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, Tom Dunson in Red River, Rooster Cogburn in True Grit, were comprehensible because their commitments were visible before their reasons were known. You understood what they would die for before you understood why. And that, Wayne argued, was what made an audience trust a man with a gun. Eastwood's counter wasn't a contradiction. It was a rotation of the same principle by about 15 degrees. Trust, he argued, didn't come from visible commitment. It came from visible competence used with restraint. The man with no name was trusted not because you knew what he would die for, but because you knew, at some cellular level, that he would not act without reason, even if the reason was never spoken. The silence wasn't absence. It was discipline. These are not small ideas. In a different context, a university film theory seminar, a serious book on Western cinema, they would occupy 30 pages and a bibliography. In Wayne's bungalow on a Thursday morning in October 1970, they were worked out in the particular shorthand of 2 men who had each spent more time on horseback in front of cameras than any film theorist alive. And here is where the philosophical anchor of this entire story sits, because the argument between Wayne and Eastwood in that room wasn't really about Westerns. It was about how a man communicates his values without declaring them. It was about the difference between showing what you would do and showing what you would not do. Wayne had spent 4 decades perfecting the first discipline. Eastwood had spent a decade discovering the second. And the distance between those 2 disciplines, not opposition, but distance, was precisely the distance between 2 generations of American masculine iconography, trying to find out if they were speaking the same language. They were, but it took the rest of the afternoon to confirm it. By November 1970, the meetings had become irregular but consistent. Not scheduled, Wayne would call through his assistant, Eastwood would either be available or not, and when they met, it was always in Wayne's bungalow or twice at a diner on Olive Avenue in Burbank where Wayne had been eating the same lunch, black coffee, a chicken sandwich, no sides, since 1957. The yellow legal paper was never mentioned again. But its ideas weren't abandoned. They were instead absorbed, turned over, examined from the angle Eastwood had offered in that first session, and slowly transformed into something neither man had started with. In January 1971, Eastwood finished editing Play Misty for me. The film had 3 beats in it that his collaborators noticed were different from the Leone pictures. 3 moments where the character he played made a choice that cost him something visible, a gesture toward the comprehensibility Wayne had argued for. They were quiet beats, easily missed, but they were there. Eastwood had not announced them or discussed them. He had simply included them, the way a man adjusts his walk after a good conversation without consciously remembering the advice. Wayne saw the film in a private screening in February 1971. He called Eastwood the next morning. "You found the middle distance," he said. "You showed me where to look," Eastwood said. "That might be where the story ends, if endings followed the clean lines we impose on them afterward. But they don't, because in April 1971, Clint Eastwood received the script for a film called Dirty Harry. And the choice he made about how to play Harry Callahan, the choices he made about what to keep silent and what to make visible, would become one of the most debated performances in the history of the American crime film. Wayne had been offered the role of Dirty Harry before Eastwood. He had turned it down. The reason he gave, publicly, in a 1974 interview with Playboy, was that Harry Callahan was morally ambiguous in ways he couldn't resolve on screen. "I couldn't look a man in the eye and tell him I was right," Wayne said, "when I wasn't sure I was right." Eastwood took the part. But here's what that story doesn't include. What wasn't filmed, what didn't make the interview circuit, what existed only in the parking lot behind Stage 12 at Warner Brothers on a late October afternoon in 1971, after Eastwood had been shooting Dirty Harry for 3 weeks and Wayne had stopped by the lot for an unrelated production meeting. The electrician Bobby Ferrara was on Stage 12 that afternoon. He was 30 feet away, working on a cable run along the back exterior wall, when the 2 men appeared from the stage exit. He recognized both of them immediately. He did not approach. He watched. Wayne was in street clothes, dark slacks, a pale blue shirt, no jacket. Eastwood was in the Dirty Harry costume, dark suit, loosened tie, the .44 Magnum holstered at his hip, because he'd come directly from a shot and hadn't changed. They stood in the parking lot for a few minutes. Ferrara couldn't hear the conversation. They were too far away and the ambient sound from the lot covered the words. But the body language, he said later, was precise enough to read. Wayne reached into his shirt pocket at some point and produced a folded piece of paper. Eastwood looked at it. He took it. Ferrara said he watched Eastwood unfold the paper, read it in about 15 seconds, refold it, and put it in his own breast pocket. The breast pocket of the Dirty Harry suit, which would have been a wardrobe problem if anyone had noticed. Then Eastwood said something. 4 or 5 words, no more. Wayne nodded once, the single deliberate nod of a man who has received something he considers an accurate statement. He turned and walked toward the lot entrance. Eastwood turned and walked back toward Stage 12. Neither man looked back. What was on the paper? Ferrara said he never knew. He saw it written and folded, but not its contents. Nobody who knew is still alive in a position to say definitively. But there are 3 clues worth examining. The first, Dirty Harry, as released in December 1971, contains exactly 3 moments, 3 beats, where Harry Callahan makes a choice that costs him something visible and unjustified, something that exists outside the plot logic of a policeman solving a case. They are quiet beats. They are easy to miss. They were not in the original screenplay. Don Siegel, the director, mentioned in a 1978 interview that several late production additions to the character were Clint's own, brought in during the 3rd week of shooting and kept because they worked but not fully explained. The second, in a 1997 American Film Institute tribute to Eastwood, Wayne's son Patrick, who had heard the parking lot story from Ferrara in the 1980s, said that his father had told him, shortly before his death in 1979, that Eastwood was the only man in Hollywood who understood why you have to let the audience see what you won't do before they'll believe what you will. The third, Eastwood, in the 2004 Directors Guild tribute, said something he had never said publicly before and has not said since, delivered in passing, in the middle of a longer thought about working with Siegel. Wayne taught me that silence is only trustworthy when the audience knows what you're silent about. Until then, it's just quiet. 23 witnesses on Stage 12. 1 witness in the parking lot. And 2 men who never formally discussed what passed between them in a document, an interview, or a record of any kind. That's the forensic evidence. Now here's what it means. The confrontation between John Wayne and Clint Eastwood in the fall of 1970 and the fall of 1971 was not a confrontation at all. It was a conversation that Hollywood didn't have a category for, a passing of something technical and profound between two men who had each, in their separate decades, solved a specific problem in the art of screen performance, and who recognized, when they finally met, that their solutions were complementary in ways that neither had planned. Wayne's philosophy, the hero who acts before the justification, whose loyalty precedes the proof, whose commitment is visible before it is understood, had shaped 40 years of American film. It was a philosophy born in the Depression, refined by war, and carried forward by a man who believed, at the cellular level, that the audience needed to trust you before they needed to understand you. Eastwood's philosophy, the hero whose restraint is itself the statement, whose silence is the evidence of something enormous being held in check, whose inaction is as deliberate and meaningful as his action, was a new answer to the same underlying question. Not how do you show a man's values, but how do you make a man's values felt without showing them? These were not opposing answers. They were the same answer in two different languages. And the yellow legal paper, folded and refolded and carried in the breast pocket of a detective's dark suit, was the moment one language was offered to a man who had already invented his own, and who chose, in the end, to carry both. That's not a story about mentorship. That's a story about two men who were large enough to recognize what the other had found. Clint Eastwood has directed 38 films since 1971. He has acted in 57. The specific gravity of the Eastwood screen presence, the restraint, the trust, the silence that implies a history too large to explain, is now studied in film schools on 4 continents. Directors from David Fincher to Sofia Coppola have cited it as a foundational influence on how they think about performance and camera. In the years since Wayne's death in June 1979, Eastwood has spoken about him with a specificity that distinguishes genuine tribute from obligatory respect. He doesn't say Wayne was the greatest or the most important. He says, in varying forms across various interviews, that Wayne was precise, that he understood the mechanics of what he was doing in a way that most performers don't, and that the understanding was transferable in the right conversation. The electrician Bobby Ferrara retired from Warner Brothers in 2003 after 32 years. He gave exactly one interview about the parking lot to a small circulation film history newsletter in 2011 and confirmed only 2 things with certainty. The paper was offered and the paper was taken. He said he spent 30 years trying to decide what was written on it, and that he eventually stopped trying because the films told him. He's right. Watch the 3 quiet beats in Dirty Harry. The moment Callahan kneels next to the wounded man at the beginning, not because the scene requires it, but because the character would. The moment in the 3rd act where he makes a choice that costs him his badge, delivered without speech, without reaction shot, without the camera lingering. The moment at the very end, the final image, where what Callahan throws away is not a symbol but a decision, and the decision tells you everything about what he values that no scene of dialogue could. Those beats didn't come from Don Siegel's direction. They didn't come from the screenplay. They came from a folded piece of yellow legal paper, written in Wayne's precise, unsentimental longhand, carried in a breast pocket. Through 3 more weeks of production, and returned to Eastwood's own notebook at the end of the shoot. Where that notebook is, nobody knows. What was in it, the films remember. Years later, specifically in the winter of 2008, in the months after Eastwood finished Gran Torino, a young director named who had just come off his first major studio picture called Eastwood for advice about a scene that wasn't working. He described the problem, an actor who was playing the silence wrong, who was filling it with visible effort, making the restraint into performance. Eastwood listened to the full description without interrupting. Then he said, "The audience needs to know what he's holding back before the silence means anything. Give them one moment, early, small, where they see what it costs him not to act. After that, every silence will carry the weight." The young director said it worked perfectly. He didn't know at the time where the advice came from. He knew only that it was specific enough to be personal, precise enough to be earned, and true in the way that only tested knowledge is true. 40 years after a parking lot in Burbank. 1 generation removed. The lesson's still traveling. That's what a real legacy looks like. Not the films that got made. Not the awards that got given. Not the box office numbers that got recorded and reported and ranked and compared. The legacy that matters is the one that keeps moving after the man has stopped. The understanding that passes from a folded piece of paper into a breast pocket, into a notebook, into a phone call, into a scene that works on a December afternoon 40 years later. John Wayne never explained himself on screen. He demonstrated. Clint Eastwood never justified his silence. He trusted it. And somewhere between those two disciplines, in a parking lot, in a bungalow, in 3 quiet beats in a film that changed American cinema, a principle was passed between two men who were large enough to recognize what the other had found. One paper, one pocket, one lesson that traveled for decades without losing a word. Wayne built his heroes on loyalty before proof. Eastwood built his on restraint before explanation. And the distance between those two disciplines was never opposition. It was the full length of the American screen hero, measured in the two men who stood at either end. But there was one conversation John Wayne had, not with Eastwood, not with anyone from the Western genre, about what he believed the screen was actually doing to the country's relationship with silence. He never allowed it to be filmed. He spoke about it once to one person in a hospital room in 1978, 11 months before he died. What he said in that room changed the way that person directed every film they made afterward. And that story, the last thing John Wayne ever confided about his work, is one that history has barely touched. That's a story for another time.